This is a review for VIII Lacrimosa of Dana. Now, what does Skyrim, Witcher 3, and Xenoblade have in common? Well, they're all awesome open-world RPG games with good storylines and characters and great gameplay, except you can only play them by yourself. What if you take one of those kind of games and you can play with a friend? Enter VIII. For years, people have been trying to mod multiplayer into Skyrim, and VIII came up with an update that allows you to play with a friend. Now, this game was not originally designed for co-op play. I'll kind of explain what you can kind of do. Co-op mode in this game is not split screen. In fact, both players share the same screen, which in many ways is actually a good thing. I found with split screen games, search your friend is a bit more casual. They have a hard time kind of like finding each other or finding out where to go because, you know, they have their own kind of screen. They kind of figure that out. When two people share the same screen, however, it's much easier for people to pick up because, you know, it's obvious where they're going because they're sharing the same screen. They see where you are, and it's pretty straightforward. Another kind of multiplayer RPG game is the Tales series, but there's a little different because the main player plays the game most of the time, and during combat, the second player can kind of jump in. The second player can play all the time. As you can see from the gameplay footage here, I am playing as the red-haired boy, while my friend is playing as the orange-haired girl. So, regardless if you're in combat or not, the second player is always in the game. So he can always move around, he can pick up items, and he can run, he can jump, so he can do whatever the first player is doing. The camera will zoom out or zoom in depending on how far the two players are, and both players can use the right analog stick to control the camera itself. So as the first player, you're probably going to try to kind of, you know, orient the camera in a sense that both players can see and get a great grasp of what's going on. And that is effective. Usually we won't have a problem with someone going off screen. And this shared screen experience is great. You know, you see each other, neither player will ever get lost. But split screen games, I find, you know, unless you're playing with really knowledgeable players, people have a hard time kind of finding each other. That problem doesn't occur in this game because you're sharing the same screen. However, since this game wasn't originally designed for multiplayer, there are some problems with this system. The first of which is that the second player is always playing as the second person in your party. That works perfectly fine, except when somebody needs to switch characters. Okay, so in this game, you get to have a party of 3 characters. Now, intuitively, since I am playing as the boy, my friend is playing as a girl, if I want to switch to the third character in our party, it should be really simple. Well, it's not. Because what happens when I press the switch buttons, I switch to the next character, which is the girl, which causes my friend to switch to the next character, which is our third character. And then when I press switch again, that switches me to the third character, and my friend plays as the first character, which is the boy. There's no way to switch characters kind of independently of each other. So whenever one person switches, the other person switches as well. Now, mechanically, that's not really a problem. It is a problem because it's disorienting. Now, as a single-player game, you know, you have the ability to switch at will, to change up your attacks. However, when it's 2 players, and when I switch, my friend also switches, that's just confusing and disorienting for his experience. Especially if we're in the middle of a boss fight. So what we find is when we're playing this together, it's really rare for us to switch characters. Unless we obviously have to. If you're playing single player, you're probably switching characters all the time. Maybe there's a way to fix this in the future, but I'm not sure if that's on their radar. I mean, in an RPG game like this, when one person switches characters, the other person shouldn't be switching. Now, the free roam in this game is actually great. Unlike some RPGs where you kind of encounter enemies on an overmap and then you jump into combat, this game doesn't do that. As you can see in the footage, you know, enemies are there. You kind of encounter them the same way you play a game like Skyrim. And you can choose to kind of skip everything, which is what we kind of do most of the time. Because, you know, we don't want to spend the time to fight them. But, you know, if you're all about getting XP or getting items, then you can, you know, fight everything. There's also fast travel in this game, so we can get around the map quite well. There's also a very in-depth crafting and resources. There's fishing, there's crafting when you get the appropriate items. So it's not just all about combat. However, the second player does not have the ability to speak to vendors or do any of these things. So as the first player, if you're kind of going to vendors, you know, and your friend is kind of just watching you do that, it can get kind of boring for him. Now, the combat of this game is actually really great. Characters can dodge. You also have special moves, which are, you know, fun to use. Every character has different abilities. The notable thing about this game is that there's different damage types. For example, the girl here, she uses a rapier, and it's a piercing damage. The main character uses slashing damage for his sword. And some enemies are very weak to certain types. Now, as a single-player game, what you would do is you would switch to the correct character to inflict that type of damage. When you're playing with two people, since it's kind of disorienting for the second player, we tend to not to switch. There's also a lot of boss fights. Boss fights are really cool. They definitely take quite a bit of skill. They're very challenging, and they're a lot of fun to play. General enemy variety is also great. Different enemies fight different. Some enemies jump. Some enemies use range attacks. Some enemies might spin around. So there's definitely a huge variety of different enemies and bosses for you to fight, which is part of the reason why the combat in this game is so good. You have a lot of player actions in different moves and being able to dodge. Well, you have quite a bit of variety in your enemies. So the combat system is great, and the fact that you can play with a friend just makes it amazing. There's a lot of different decision making, even as you're just venturing in the world. I would say like, hey, let's just skip everything. My friend might want to hit a few enemies, or we will run somewhere and we see like a big monster, not really a boss. And my friend is like, should we fight him? And then we make that decision if should we fight him or should we just skip him. I know it doesn't sound like much, but it's a lot of fun because there's a lot of collaboration, there's a lot of communication involved. Because if I'm playing a single player game, I just choose to just mentally skip the monster. I just run past him. On the other hand, when you have a friend with you and you're deciding whether or not you want to skip or you want to fight it, or maybe one person says skip, the other person wants to fight it anyway. Or one person runs past a bunch of enemies while the other person sees like a treasure you can pick up and then he gets it. And there's a certain feeling of accomplishment when that happens. Now, although this game isn't designed for multiplayer, I would just say this is one of the most fun kind of multiplayer adventure games I've ever played. The fact that there's so much freedom, whether or not you want to just run past everything or you want to fight. One person wants to run, the other person wants to fight. Or you coordinate together to run as fast as you can. You actually have to coordinate just to do that. This is not split screen. In a split screen game, you might have one person running off, past all the enemies, while the other person kind of gets stuck back there. Since you're sharing the same screen, that can't happen. If you're running too fast and your friend can't catch up to you, well, you're going to have to go back and then make sure that he catches up. There's also no separate inventories for the two characters. I mean, you can equip different characters different equipment, obviously. But whenever you collect items like iron ore or fish or food, it's only on the main character's inventory. This also kind of makes your inventory management a lot simpler because you don't have to manage, multiple inventories. Now, this game is not dependent on its co-op feature. And as a single player experience, it's perfectly fine and a great game. But all I'm saying is that the fact that you can play with a friend just makes this game much, much better. And it's also fairly casual friendly because, again, you're sharing the same screen. And you can also change the difficulty at will. Now, what's kind of cool is that when you lower the difficulty, it doesn't actually make the enemies easier. What it does is that when you're about to die, it sets you to one health point. So in that point, you can, drink a potion or something to heal up. This is really cool. So when you're fighting regular shaft enemies, the game doesn't get too easy. And it only kind of helps you when you're fighting against enemies that you need help on, which are, big tough bosses. It's a very creative way of lowering the difficulty level. The one thing I was worried about is like, if I lower the difficulty level for a really tough section, I kind of have to raise the difficulty level again after I beat that section. This game, you don't really need to do that because the difficulty level really only affects things that are difficult for you to beat. Since this game is fairly casual friendly, you can easily play with someone who's not very good at video games, or your child, or your girlfriend, and you guys will have a lot of fun together. As a JRPG, this obviously have a full-fledged story, and you have cutscenes, you have dialogue, although a lot of the game isn't actually voiced. Some of the game is, but a lot of the sections of the game there's no voices and you're just reading, which is kind of annoying. But obviously, whatever budget or time they might have had, they might not be able to voice the whole game. But the game is at least partially voiced. I've gushed about how much I like this game and why it's so much fun, but of course there are a few problems, as I said. Notably, switching characters on two-player mode is a little confusing, but that's not a major problem. Overall, this is a great game by its own right, made much, much better by being able to play with a friend. So I wholeheartedly recommend you get this game. Now, this game doesn't have online co-op, so keep that in mind. This is a great game by itself, even without multiplayer, but as a multiplayer game, this is a must-have. In fact, one thing I am interested in with the way Ys 8 implemented multiplayer, I'd love to see more kind of RPG and open world games with this sort of multiplayer capability. Something like The Witcher or even Legend of Zelda can probably do this kind of multiplayer in some capacity. Even Assassin's Creed. See, there'll be some limitations, like using ranged weapons, And in this game, there's no ranged weapons you can aim. I would love to see this kind of idea expanded on. People did try to do a local multiplayer mod for Skyrim. There's no split screen, so it was kind of difficult to play. See, Skyrim is a first-person game that involves kind of aiming, so it's really difficult to play that game without a split screen feature, but this RPG doesn't have that problem. One thing I like to add is that there is a lot of loading screens in this game. Time you enter a new small area, there's a loading screen. But when the game is on an SSD, it loads quick enough, so that's not a problem. I highly recommend you use an SSD for this game. And one more thing to add, this game is also quite child friendly, and